Grace never seems fair until you need some. There's one of my favorite authors named Bob Goff wrote that on Twitter a couple of years ago. In fact, it's probably in one of his books. I'm not really sure. But grace never seems fair until you get some. It's funny because I read that and initially it sounds good. But then I think back on my life and I've seen this play out firsthand. And I realize one of the most obvious universal ways that you've probably noticed this in your own life is when it comes to driving. And especially since we're in California, this becomes all the more obvious because driving here is just fun. It's sort of like being in the jungle. You never know what you're going to come across. And I just know in my own life that when I have to extend or when someone does something to me in traffic that just drives me insane, they cut me off, they honk their horn at me, or they're a jerk in some way, they do something rude, like instantly I can pronounce judgment upon them because they are a jerk. Or because they're dumb, or because they're oblivious, or whatever it is. There's plenty of words we use for drivers that annoy us that I'm certainly not going to repeat right now. But we have our own ways of dealing with that, and it's just interesting how judgmental we can get when someone cuts us off, or when someone slams on their brake and we don't understand why, or something like that. And then you think about the times you've had to do those things, and it's always justified, right? Well, I had to get over, so this guy should give me room. Or, well, there was something in the road or whatever. We're really good at justifying when we do the very thing that we hate seeing other people do. Because grace always seems unfair until you need some, right? In fact, I think one of the most egregious places in my life where I've had to experience this was when Lex and I were first moving into town, and I was driving our big, 20 or 24 foot, I can't remember, gigantic U-Haul type thing, and Alexa had missed a light out in 29, coming into town. Actually, it was in Joshua Tree coming into town. And so I pulled off on the side of the road, and by the time I turned back around to get back on the road, I realized the light had turned green, and cars were already careening towards me, which means I had two options. I could just be patient and wait and hope that Alexa noticed I was on the side of the road, and then she would pull off and wait for me to catch up with her, because her phone didn't really do GPS. This was a while ago, almost 9 years ago. And so I was the one with the GPS. I was the one with the instructions. So she didn't know where she was going. So I could have done that. But as you can imagine, that is certainly not went through my head. In a split second, I thought, they'll slow down. And so I pulled right out in front of everyone who was speeding up to 60 miles an hour or so. And in my mind, I'm thinking, you know what, they'll just go around me. It's not a big problem, right? Because it's justified, right? But if I was one of those drivers and I see this crazy person pull out in front of me in some gigantic U-Haul thing, you can bet there would be certain words flying through my head to describe this person. Because grace always seems unfair until you are the one who's in need of grace. Jesus told a parable once that kind of perfectly encapsulates this idea. He said that there was a farmer. If you're there in Matthew 20, you can read this parable for yourself. But there was a landowner who wanted to go and hire some people to do some work on his land. And so he went to where people would always gather. It's like the spot in town that if you were a worker, you needed work, you would go and stand there and wait for someone to call your name and let you go and you work and you actually earn some money. So he did that right at 9 o'clock in the morning. Went and hired a few guys. He told them, here's the wage I'm going to pay you. And went ahead and brought them back, and they started working. And around noon, he thought, I could get some more help. And so he went back there, hired a few more people. He went back again at 3 o'clock, offering the exact same amount of money every time he would go back, 3 o'clock. And so finally at 5 o'clock, when there was only about an hour left of work, he went back there. He hired a few more people, offering them the exact same wage, and brought them back. And so they worked that last hour. Everyone got their work done, and so the end of the day came, and the landowner starts passing out the wage. Everyone's getting the exact same amount. The people who worked from 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, all of them got the exact same wage. And so, of course, when the 9 o'clock people step up, they're the last ones to get paid, and they go up there, they have some questions. Hey, we've been working since 9. Well, why are we getting the exact same amount as these people who worked until 5 or only worked for an hour or so? And so landowner says, didn't you agree to this amount? In this, what you said would be okay? Well, yeah, but we just figured, you paid these people the same amount. And they wonder, and honestly, this parable has caused a lot of discussion amongst people, because from our view, we're like, how unfair is this? That this landowner would pay the same amount to someone who's worked from 9 a.m. and someone who worked for only an hour? That seems unfair, and it seems ridiculous. But just imagine for a moment what it was like for that person who got hired at 5 o'clock, right? All day they've been waiting there. In fact, Jesus even says when they went to go hire him, the landowner said, why are you still here? And they said, well, no one's hired us. All day they've been waiting. All day they've been trying to get hired, trying to get a job. And I wonder, why did they stick around? I mean, most people, after you didn't get hired around 9 o'clock, you'd probably go back home and say, maybe there's some stuff I can get done at home. And so we don't know for sure. Maybe they stuck around because they just couldn't face going back home and saying, we're not going to eat tonight. I didn't get hired. I didn't get picked. Maybe they thought that they could get at least something, right? Maybe I can go work an hour, get paid for an hour or something. So at least when I walk in the door, I can show my family I've worked for this. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is from their perspective, they found this incredibly generous landowner who said, I will pay you a day's wage even though you only worked for an hour. See, it's so easy for us to focus on how unfair this is because we don't picture ourselves as the ones hired at 5. We picture ourselves as the ones hired at 9. How unfair is it they get the same treatment as me? Grace always seems unfair until you need some. The story that we're going to read here in Luke 23 is falling within that same general context of grace and the way that it seems unfair to us sometimes. This week we're going to be celebrating, which seems like a weird thing to say, but we celebrate what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross. Every single day, depending on what denominational background you come from, there's certain things in place that help remind us of Jesus' last week, which John records almost half of his gospel to just that last week. But we celebrate that sort of stepping up to the moment when Jesus gave his life. And where we find Jesus here in Luke 23 is on the cross. And he's dying at this point. Obviously, crucifixion was meant to accomplish that feat. But when Jesus was crucified, he was put next to 2 other people, criminals to be exact. They're described as insurrectionists, as criminals, as not very good people. And there Jesus hangs between 2 criminals, which Jesus had said would happen. I'm going to be counted among criminals. And there he was hanging with these 2 guys. And we're going to read an interaction. And one specific person will jump out to us when we read these few verses. And this is someone who's been called the penitent thief. He's been called all sorts of different names. In fact, if you look through history, he's been given actual names from different sources. We don't know for sure. The Bible just mentions him as criminal. In fact, if this were a stage play, he would be criminal number 2 or something like that. We aren't told his name. But this guy is someone that if we understand the context of their world, we might understand a little bit more. See, they're called insurrectionists for a reason, because these are people that tried to rise up against Rome. They were people who were trying to overcome their oppressors, the people who were making Judaism more difficult for them, the people who were taxing them beyond belief. And these guys probably tried to start an uprising, tried to overcome these Romans, and maybe thinking back on their history, thought that they could be great like some of the people they looked up to. In fact, if you go and you explore the history between the Testaments, you can see that time after time, the Jews kept getting oppressed. And at one point, the Greeks had come in. These were like the people after Alexander the Great, some of his, not descendants, but the people who started rule after Alexander the Great, started doing some very awful things to the Jews. And at one point, outlawed every aspect of Judaism. They weren't able to do anything that their faith required of them. And then called them to sacrifice to other false gods in God's temple. And there's a story of a guy named Mattathias. Have any of you ever heard of Mattathias? Okay, yes, fantastic. Okay, well, now you all are going to remember Mattathias. And when you have kids, you're going to name them Mattathias. I'm just going to guarantee that. But Mattathias was an older priest at a town that the Greeks had come through, a couple of soldiers, and told him, you must offer a sacrifice to this false god. And Mattathias refused over and over, saying, no, I'm not going to do this, even under threat of death. And so a fellow Jew stood up and said, I'll do it. So this Jew stood up and started to move forward as if he was going to offer the sacrifice. And Mattathias, in what had to have been just a flood of emotion, anger, and just righteous indignation, killed the fellow Jew. And then the soldiers who were demanding this sacrifice take place. And thus began what's called the Maccabean Revolt, which you can read about in the Apocrypha. If you have a Catholic Bible, you'll see 1st, 2nd Maccabees in there, and you can read a little more about that. But Mattathias' sons then kind of took over, and through power and will and fighting over the course of about 10 years, they overthrew this Greek oppression. And so I wonder if maybe these two guys thought, I'm going to be like Mattathias. I'm going to overcome this Roman oppression. I'm going to be the one that they're going to tell stories about. There's going to be a book named after me. And then things just didn't go according to plan. We don't know how. We don't know what exactly they did outside of the kind of general terms for how they're described. But clearly, they did something bad enough to deserve crucifixion. And so there they hung right next to Jesus. And this is the interaction we get between these two guys and Jesus. If you're there in Luke 23, pick it up in verse 39. And it says this, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We're punished justly, for we're getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It's remarkable, this interaction Jesus has with this thief, this insurrectionist, this criminal. Especially when you consider that not only do we not know much about the life of this man, but even this interaction doesn't tell us a whole lot about him. He just calls out and he doesn't say, Jesus, forgive me. He doesn't say, Jesus, I pray that you would save me. He just says, Jesus, when you come back in your glory, in your kingdom, which most people take to mean the second coming, whatever, when Jesus, when you come back and you're fully in your power, remember me. He doesn't even say, I hope I'm with you. He doesn't even say, I hope that somehow I'll be a part of that. He just says, I want you to remember this moment, Jesus. And Jesus one-ups that. And he says, not only am I going to remember you, but today is going to be a special day for you. You and I are going to go for a walk. And the word that he uses for paradise is a word that when the Greek translation, the Old Testament, popped up, it was the same word for Eden. It means a walled garden. It was like a place of honor, a place of perfection. Today, you and I are going to go take a walk. That's an incredible grace. And so many of us, when we read this story of the two thieves, we gravitate towards this other thief. And we imagine that if I were in that situation, I would be the same way. I would have the same attitude, and I would want to stand up for Jesus in the same way that that guy did. But I don't think we recognize, or we don't really want to recognize, how much we can probably relate to the other thief. Because think about it from his perspective. He figured that this Messiah who would come would be like Mattathias 2.0. He would do so much more than what Mattathias and the Maccabees were able to do. He would overthrow Rome. He would overthrow these oppressors. He would be leading an army of people. In fact, when this thief speaks out and says, if you are the Messiah, in essence, he's saying, I know you're not him. Why? The Messiah is not going to be like this. The Messiah is not going to be some guy dying on a cross at the hand of his oppressors. He will be leading that insurrection. And if you were the Messiah, we would have succeeded. He is basically telling Jesus, I know who my God is, I know who the Messiah is, and you're not him. Because like so many people today, his view of God, his view of Jesus, was not met by what he physically saw. Think about how many people have left the church for that exact same reason. How many people who once professed Jesus as Christ, who once said that they were a Christian, who are now away from it because God did not live up to the expectations that had been laid before them. That's one of the reasons why so many theologies I hear on the radio and I see on TV are dangerous, because you are promising people that God is like something he is not. God is not someone who will just bow to your will and do whatever you ask, even if it's something good. I'm not just talking about those joking times when I say that, God is not like your genie, where if you read the Bible a certain way and you pray for a Ferrari will just pop up in your garage. Like that we all know is false. I'm talking about the times where we pray to God for something good to happen. And it doesn't. If we understand that God's will does not always line up with ours, we can deal with that tension. But when you promise someone that if you have enough faith, healing will occur. If you have enough faith, relationships will be restored. If you have enough faith, your wallet will suddenly get a whole lot thicker. Your job will be going so much better. If you make those promises, God does never once guarantee that those are going to happen. And when they don't, what you have now done is set them up to fall. Because you've told them about a God that does not exist. You realize that if Jesus had given in and said, okay, I'll save you and I'll save myself, and walked off that cross, in that moment, how happy would that thief have been? I mean, he just got saved from execution, and a painful one at that. I mean, to be restored from that, to be healed and taken away, how awesome would that be? How happy would he be? And yet, he would be damned to hell for all eternity. Sometimes we don't understand God's will because we can't see what's really happening. Jesus had to die in order to bring us salvation. And in the moment, that probably didn't make much sense to this guy who was suffering right beside him. That's one of the things that should amaze us about this other guy. That is the reason why so many of us are gravitating towards him, because he was able to see past what was physically taking place and just trust in who Jesus said that he was. Now, we don't know how much he knew about Jesus. My guess is that he had heard about him. Jesus had made a name for himself. He had maybe even seen Jesus perform miracles. We don't really know anything about his background. All that we know is that this guy, in the last few minutes of his life, stood up for Jesus and believed that Jesus was going to come back in power in some way. And Jesus rewarded that faith. Now, a question we should ask ourselves, is that the type of faith that I have? That can overlook what's physically happening in this world in my life and be able to trust Jesus no matter what? Just believing that God's will is actually what needs to happen. God's will is what is good, even if it's conflicting with my will. But even more than that, on top of that whole idea of our faith in God, no matter what's going on around us, also understand that grace never seems fair until you need some. Think about this thief, this insurrectionist, this probably murderer that was hanging next to Jesus. He never had to endure what so many of us have to endure. When you turn your life around and you give your life to Jesus, it's not an immediate healing where everything is better and suddenly the struggles I had yesterday are no longer today, and I'm not tempted to be angry anymore because I'm a Christian. I'm not tempted to lust anymore because I'm a Christian. I'm not tempted to do drugs anymore because I'm a Christian. We know full well that's not how it works. Most of the time, I've heard unique stories where God's brought that type of healing, but overall, we have to work, and God has to work on us to show us what true repentance looks like, and failing along the way and having to endure through suffering and change and trying to become better. And this guy didn't have to go through any of that. This guy who had given his life over to insurrection and anger and vengeance and revenge and all of this thought just got to die and go be with Jesus in heaven without having to go through all that stuff that we have to. And it would be so easy for us to sit on the back and say, he doesn't have to endure what I have to endure. How is this fair that at the end of eternity, he gets the same stuff that I get? He gets to endure an eternity with God forever like me, but I had to endure this life a whole lot longer. Because grace always seems unfair until we need some. See, that's the aspect of this story I think we sometimes overlook. We love the idea of this thief being saved. We love the idea of Jesus bringing forgiveness to a man who certainly did not earn it in his lifetime, but we still struggle in our own lives when we're confronted with people very similarly. When Jesus started off his ministry, if you're still there in Luke, flip back to Luke chapter 4. And I'm not going to dive too deep into this passage because in the next sermon series, we're actually going to take a whole Sunday and look at this. But Jesus reads from a passage in Isaiah in the middle of Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 18. And he's going to say some things that are going to upset a few people. And once again, we'll look as to why that is, but we'll be able to get a taste of it this morning at least. But there in Luke 4, starting in verse 18, Jesus says this, reading from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." In other words, what Jesus said is this passage I just read, which he brings in not just one main passage of Isaiah, but he incorporates a couple of other spots. He says, this is why I'm here. This is why Messiah has come. And he's breaking down barriers that they didn't want to admit could be broken down by God himself. I mean, look at some of the things that Jesus says here and really take a moment to soberly dwell on this. Because he says, proclaim good news to the poor. He doesn't just say the poor with a heart of gold. When we think of the poor, we think of the people who are trying as hard as they can, and yet they can't get a foothold in life, where they're just struggling, but they just can't make it, no matter how hard they try. But you realize the poor also includes people who are poor because of their sin, because of their struggles, and because of their weaknesses, who perhaps are homeless because of their own faults, their own doings. Jesus doesn't say, I'm here to proclaim good news just to the ones with a heart of gold, but to all. And he also mentions to proclaim freedom to the prisoners. That one should be a little more obvious to us. I mean, think of this guy on the cross and the life that he lived, the things that brought him to that point where Rome would crucify him. Jesus announces grace to someone like that as well. See, we can't take time to go through our life making our own judgments as to who's worthy of God's grace and who's not. And it's so easy to do that. It's so easy to discern whether this person or that person is worthy of hearing the grace of Jesus because of their political beliefs, because of their theological beliefs, because of where they are right now. And we just put up barriers wherever. And Jesus says, I came here to break them all down. And people got offended. That's why a couple of weeks ago I said that the grace of Jesus is perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of Christianity. And we don't even realize it. Because the forgiveness he offers to all people, even the worst of these. See, maybe another way of phrasing that grace never seems fair until you get some is also that grace never seems fair when it's offered to someone who doesn't have a heart of gold. Someone whose life we look at and we see only time and time again they're rebelling against the God of the universe. Their support of things that you find absolutely disgusting or atrocious. Jesus doesn't put up those barriers for us and says, go out into the world and bring the good news to the people who are pretty good at heart. He says, bring it to all the world. In fact, one time Jesus told another parable about fishing and said that it's very similar to how a fisherman will just catch a big old thing of fish and throw out the bad ones and the weeds and whatnot and only bring back the good fish. And he says, in the same way, just fish. Let me sort them out later. If you've ever watched The Chosen, he uses that parable in that show as well, which, by the way, I really recommend that. Kind of off topic here, but that same idea that we are called to go into the world and just fish for people and just trust that God will sort them out later. You don't have to make the judgment as to whether someone's going to be saved or not. We have the at least general idea of we know they need to come to Jesus. We know that they need to trust in Jesus fully for their salvation. But outside of that, those judgment calls are up to God. And we just trust that he knows what he's doing because he does. I mean, it kind of comes back if you were to ask yourself, how do I know I'm saved? If you were to die right now and stand before God and he asks you, how can you be saved? How are you saved? There's only one answer. There's only one answer there. It's because of Jesus that I'm saved. And that's how this thief on the cross, who didn't have to endure what so many of us have to endure with turning your life around, how he can be saved. Because it's not your works. We're going to look at that also in the next series, that kind of tension between faith and works. And you're not saved by your works, but you're saved for works and dealing with all that. But Jesus has called us to go and fish, to go and make disciples, and to just recognize in a humble way that grace never seems fair until I need some. We're going to sing a few songs as we finish up this morning. This week, as we walk closer and make our way towards Easter, I want you to take that time to think about what Jesus went through for you. And just take a moment to imagine what Jesus endured for us. When we take the juice and the bread, we have a moment where we can reflect and thank God and ask Jesus, help me to understand what you gave up for me. And we can be so thankful that Jesus would love me enough to die for me. But also remember that gift is not just for you. We can bring that gift to the world. If you're able, let's stand and let's praise God now.